Thank you so much for being here again. This is Paris IAS Ideas. And this is the third speaker of our session today. We are very happy to welcome Professor Tamar FLASH. Professor FLASH is an emeritus professor at the Department of Computer Science and Applied Mathematics at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel. And she is a member of the International Neurophysiological Society and an international honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Thank you so much, Professor FLASH, for being with us, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much for having me, invited me here at the IEA. I loved it when I was here in 1917, and I'm very happy to be back. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my plans and the research I've been doing and what I'm going to do during the stay here. So the topic I'll be working on is neural encoding and brain networks for the space-time representation of movement in the brain, especially in the brain of humans. And we are talking about quite complicated behavior. Motor behavior is quite complex and very rich and very versatile. And the question is how to study it in the brain. So there are many different possible directions to look at it. I've been focusing on, and me and my colleagues and my students, I have been focusing on combining computational models with really experimental observation and trying to suggest mathematical models that will capture essential issues and representation about movement. So here we go back to the work of the pioneering work of Nikolai Bernstein, who is well known in the field, passed away many years ago. And he said that there exists in the higher levels of the central nervous system, what we mean is by the cortex, which are the cortical areas in higher levels, there are a representation of space and time and not necessarily directly representation of joint and muscles. So the brain has a complicated representation, but there is hierarchical organization. So at the higher level, we represent things that has to do with the kinematics, the geometry, the time and space of the movement, and only later at lower level, we represent the commands. And here we see it actually in this figure because you see the word coordination when it was written by different kinds of parts of the arm or leg or even the mouth, and they all look the same, meaning that you have the same representation of the geometry and the temporal development of movement. So these are many, many questions we are asking about the motor system as vis-a-vis what is the organization of the motor system and the different levels of the hierarchy. What kind of strategies does the brain has evolved to simplify the problem, but also what are the space-time geometry that are used to represent movement. So what we do in the laboratory is we look at what people do, for example, when they have to do movement from one point to the other, which is, if you go on the screen, you can see it on the right. There is you see this velocity curve, and the movement is roughly straight. So we all do it when we do movement from between 2 points. But if you look at that was on the left. In the right side, you'll see that if we do a movement that has more curved, we don't have one peak of velocity, but we have several peaks. And we all slow down at points that have more curvature, that are more curved. So it's all what we do, all of us. And the question is, why do we pick these particular movements? So already many years ago, together with my PhD supervisor, Neville Ogden from MIT, we suggested that the brain prefers to do the smoothest possible motion. And disregard the mathematics. I know that you are not all mathematicians, but the idea is that everybody knows what velocity is and what acceleration is. And what the brain prefers to do is to have at least changes in acceleration. So the movements becomes much more smooth and much more predictable. And this is a very good model to actually predict all the features of both straight and curved movements. So another thing which is very important in the movement is if I do the same movement with a large scale or a small scale, I draw a 1 centimeter movement or a meter, the velocity of the movement is the same, has the same shape of the velocity curves, but it's only scaled with a factor. And this way we really simplify the planning of the movement. Another very important or very interesting features is when I'm drawing, for example, an ellipse. So when all of us draw an ellipse, we actually slows down at the parts that are more curved, as you see here. And it's true not only for movements of the hands on a piece of paper, but it's also true if we look at the movement of the full body that was done in Paris with a group of Alain Bertos, and we look at the movement of the center of mass, we also slow down at more curved parts. So that means that the brain has the same principle for different parts of the body when we do a particular kind of movement in external space. So these are very interesting things, and it was captured by a model that says that actually the velocity of the movement is proportional to the curvature. You can really mathematically express it that the velocity is always proportional to the curvature with some exponent. Exponent is you have a power. And the power is not 1/2, it's actually 1/3 if we draw an ellipse. So we all do it the same way. It's a very important law. We call it the 2/3 power law. And it also can be generalized not only for ellipses or other simple movement, but it can generalize across quite complicated movements. So these are very strong, robust behaviors that were captured again and again in different kind of experimental tasks. So we have these laws of motion, and you also you can also look at this exponent downstairs, and you can express and predict what it will be according to the geometry of the drawing that I'm making. So you can explore even this very complicated drawing that you see on the right, and I can tell you what will be the exponent from these mathematical principles. But we also study whether you have two different models, the minimum jerk, which is this maximum smoothness movement, and the power law, and you can join them together, which is very important, not to have too many models. They predict the same thing. So the smoothest motion of our limbs is the one that also obeys the power law. Okay, so the question is, which is very fundamental, for years, philosophers have asked, what is connection between space and time? How do we choose time for any behavior, any movement, any action? And we also asked, what is the geometry of the motor movements? So this is something I actually did with colleagues, my students in Israel, back in Israel, but also with colleagues here in France, again, with Professor Bertos, with my former student, Ronit Fuchs, but also with Daniel Beneken, who is a professor of geometry in Paris. So why do we care so much about geometry? Because we know that it's not only mathematics where geometry is important, it has become very important also in physics. For example, general relativity is also based on the geometries, different kind of geometries. So we thought maybe we can bring geometry into the field of brain research and also cognitive science. And finally, maybe it will also be very useful in artificial intelligence for robotics, for example. So we all live in the world where we think that everything is Cartesian. So you have this 90 degrees between the x, y, the coordinates, and we think everything is Euclidean, like Euclid have stated a five statement. But actually, we know from physics also that the geometry that we use to describe gravity or whatever is not only Euclidean. We may use what is called non-Euclidean geometries, and there are very different kind of geometries. Now, if we look at external world, we see things that converge in perspective, or we think the things coming from far away, we have this transformation. So also in philosophy, people like Cassirer, well-known philosopher, and Felix Klein say that these geometries are very important for perception and for action. So we have used this kind of different geometry also for the description of movement and movement perception, movement production, and also for vision. So what I'm saying, we had this power law. I know maybe it's too much to go through, but we have this power law, what I told you, it's called 1/3 or 2/3 power law, for example, to describe a movement moving along the ellipse. We can show mathematically that the fact that you slow down at more curved part of the movement and you have this power law comes because you are using non-Euclidean geometries, other geometries, for example, what we call affine geometries, where you don't have this kind of 90 degrees between the different directions, and you have other laws that are not Euclidean. So there's another important French mathematician, Cartan, who also thought about having not only static coordinate frame, but moving frames. So when we walk in the world, we have a frame that moves with us, and the brain needs to update all the time the moving coordinate system. So we can merge together the idea of movement and geometry by using these moving coordinate frames. So what does it mean to be affine? Affine means that I don't have 90 degrees between the x and y direction. I can take a trapezoid, I can stretch it, I can differently in different directions, but the area remains the same. This is equivalent mathematically to moving at a constant equiaffine velocity. So what we did here, we took all this drawing of human movements and we transferred them from Cartesian or Euclidean world into equiaffine. And the 2/3 power law is equivalent to moving at a constant equiaffine speed. So this is very interesting that the brain may not use only Euclidean geometry. It may use this non-Euclidean geometry, other geometry, and we see it we can predict what does it mean in terms of the representation of movement in the brain. Now, we even went further beyond this level because we said maybe the brain doesn't use either Euclidean geometry or affine geometry or projective like in perspective, but maybe we have this mixture of representation of different movements. So when I see something which is close to me, like in projective geometry, like perspective, I use projective geometry. If something is far away, I use affine geometry. And different neurons in the brain can use one geometry or other or combination of these geometries. So this kind of description also helps us account for the fact that you have, when you do different movements of different sizes, you do it roughly in the same time. So if I do a small movement or a big movement, I do it roughly in the same time. It's called principle of isochrony. So, and this is the idea that you have a mixture of geometries, affine, equiaffine, and Euclidean. Never mind, we can skip that. Maybe it's too complicated. And we want to ask, how do we use this kind of geometry not only to predict the movements, but we can also predict the time, the duration of the movement that it takes us. And I will not go now into really explaining how we do it mathematically, but you can actually predict the time is dictated by the geometry of the movement that we are using. So if I move at a constant equiaffine velocity, I have one duration. And if I have a different kind of geometry, like a giant affine geometry, I'll move with a different duration, as this is the prediction we are testing in the laboratory. Now, all these things were done before. I continue working on this field. But the question is, can we find neural evidence from the brain itself that the brain really uses this kind of geometries for perceiving motion and for producing movement? So can we measure the activities of different neurons in the brain and look at different population of neurons and say which kind of geometry it encodes? Does it encode affine, equiaffine, Euclidean? And also by now we know that the brain is not only working with individual elementary neurons, single neurons, but we work through population of neurons. So you have like an assembly of neurons that work together and represent some variables. So the question is, can we develop insight into the computation that different neural networks are performing and how information is transmitted from different parts of the brain to other parts? Do we have kind of propagating waves that transform information from different parts of the brain? And this way we can say something about more general organization. And if we learn interesting principle, maybe we can use it also for robotics or for artificial intelligence and for tasks like autonomous driving or for drones or for other things. So I told you that we believe we have some evidence that the brain uses this affine representation of movement. I can explain if you wanted the question, what does it mean, this affine? And so more recently, my student David Ungarish, based on the work of Meirovich, we were trying to find whether we can have evidence from looking at neural activities about this kind of geometries. So what you do is nowadays you can record activities in the brains of monkeys, using many electrodes. And we wanted to see if this representation through affine transformation simplify the representation of the movement, and whether we have specific population of neurons that represent this different kind of geometry, this affine geometry, whether there are others or represent Euclidean geometries. So what we do is we take the activities of neuron in monkeys' brain, while the monkeys do all kinds of movement, they straight line or complicated drawing. We have experimental data. And we ask if two movements are very much similar in terms of this affine transformation, do we find also similar neural representation in the brain? So really, this is a technical machine learning system that maybe it's too much to talk about it on the details, I can tell you, but we indeed found, which is very exciting for us, this evidence that segments of the movement that are very similar, not in terms of just they look the same in terms of Euclidean geometry, but they also similar in terms of affine transformation. They also have similar neural representation in the brain. And we took this big population neurons. We can find within 100 cells, we found 80 neurons that are more representing Euclidean geometry, and 20% that represent affine. And you have this different population that together will represent both the space and the time and the velocity of the movement. So without going into further details, this is what I want to describe in this paper. We also studied large networks of the brain when we look at motion. So this is a quite condensed slide, but it shows what happens if we put a person into the magnet, fMRI, and showed him an ellipse, and the person himself can control the way the movement is moving along the ellipse. The dots are moving along the ellipse. So one time it moves in constant velocity all the time, and one time it moves like we human moves, which slow down at more curved parts. And then we look in the brain, the fMRI, and says, what areas of the brain represent this affine movement, what we call affine velocity? And we see a very large network of areas in the motor system that represent more strongly this affine representation, which is more natural of human movement. And very interestingly, you may have heard about the mirror neurons that are very important for social interactions and for understanding the other person. And we think it builds about principle of movement. And we see that within this mirror area, we also have a stronger representation of affine movements. Now, let me go also to what we do in terms of diseases. So, for example, we know about the Parkinson's disease that is affecting a large population of people. We know the areas in the brain that are involved in Parkinson because you have cells that produce dopamine are dying. But we know also what's the symptoms of movement. For example, people become very slow, moving very slowly with small step, they have tremor, and they also have depression, and they also have all kinds of trouble in sleeping. But the question is whether the studies we suggested can also help in diagnose who is going to have Parkinson and what are the symptoms in Parkinson. So as I told you, one symptom is that people are very slow, okay? And in the power law, the description that I told you, there is a factor that controls the speed of the movement. So if we want to move faster, you can find it from this kinematic model that we developed. So we studied how people, here you see this actually the phenomena of for slowing down. So in the left side, you have this normal speed and normal movements. In the right, you have this very slow movement with a lot of tremor. That's what we see. The movements are no longer smooth, okay? And we want to now, we have these models to describe them, but can we say what is the effect of medicine on these symptoms? Can we quantify the improvement that goes with medicine, etc.? So I'll skip that. And indeed, when we use this power law, you'll see the blue bars representing the parameter that we extract for movement of healthy subjects, and the green line are for movement of patients. So you see, when people are healthy, what I told you, the exponent that before was 1/3 or other exponent is up, it's much closer to the normal and healthy subject, but in patients, it's much lower than in normal. The same thing is this velocity gain factor, which is lower in Parkinson and is normal as predicted by the model in healthy subjects. So you see, this is another way of using this mathematical model also to help medicine to diagnose and to see the effect of medication. So just let me summarize all. We saw that in motor production, there are large networks of neural population, but we can identify how you have this mixture of population. Each mixture, each subpopulation codes for another parameter. Together, they work in a wonderful symphony to create smooth and healthy movements with the right speed. There are specific areas that have different function. For example, in Parkinson, we have slowing down if this area is affected. And you see that the scaling of speed goes with the model that we can predict. We also show that you have the same principle in perception and action of movements. And it may be very important, not only, we also doing studies in autistic subject. We found there also some deficit in this description by power laws. And finally, we would like to generate a unifying theory that bridges between the brain encodes in the movement and what we can see from the outside, from the behavioral expression of this functioning of the brain. So thank you, and let me know if you have further questions. And don't be shy to ask if you, I know you are not mathematical, so if you want to ask me something specific, I'll be glad to answer and clarify better. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Yes, I see a couple of questions already. Sadi?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very, very dense talk and impressive. It made me thought of Jacob von Uexküll theoretical biology work. I don't know if you were aware of that stuff that he wrote in 1926. I mean, he's exactly trying to see how you can reconstruct movements and the representation of space and time based actually on what he calls the sense qualities as the ultimate elements of our intuition, and as such are quite independent unities which are indivisible and capable of change only in their intensity. He follows Helmholtz in the idea that
I know Helmholtz, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I guess it's really a absolutely fabulous book. It's much unappreciated at most of von Uexküll's work, but and it's also beyond my understanding. But I guess the idea is that movement and cognition are based on the physiological representation of our environment, and the coding of our movements is also completely dependent actually on our physiology. So what the laws that you're finding are based on the very structure. And there's also interesting things about the symmetry of the body and how this influences the way we operate. I feel that you're working on some so basic notions of what is the organization of life and higher cognition. It's just fabulous. I think it would be really interesting for you to see how these intuitions of Uexküll and also the experiments that he's describing, trying to connect how dense, for example, or some regions of perception on different organs and the movement that comes with it could be linked to your current experiments. This is just something I throw in the discussion. I must honestly say that the text of Uexküll is so dense and philosophical and technically alien to the way we think usually that it went beyond my understanding, but I'm sure that for you, this will be more understandable.
I'd love to see that actually. And I know that bigger, more well-known scientists like Piaget even also talked about the perception of time and space. And he emphasized the importance of geometry and topology and geometry. So I think it would be very interesting because it talks not only about the actual execution of the movement, but also the perception of space and imagery, what we have in how we imagine things which also uses the same kind of perception. So, so thank you very much. I'll be glad to learn about it. Yeah.
I managed to get a digital version. I'll give it to you.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
Sorry. Next, we have Daniel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tamar. I have two questions. I hope that's not too greedy. The first one was about kind of building on what Sadi said. Is your kind of way of thinking, but building into this view that like the motor cortex is not really encoding like primitives of movement, but it's encoding like the kind of distal goals of actions in a kind of sensory kind of coordinate space? And if so, I wondered if you knew of work by Ricardo Schumotz on what happens when people have lesions of the motor cortex and premotor cortex, that it doesn't just obviously interrupt your ability to move, but you can get people who have quite strange perceptual prediction problems that even with no requirement to move, people get good at perceiving spatial and temporal sequences.
Yeah. So first to the first question. So what's so complicated about the brain? We have both things that are to do with the external space and what my hand will do in the external world, but also of muscles or joints. So that's what makes this study so complicated. We need to know, so maybe sub-networks or sub-areas do other things. For example, we know that there is basal ganglia, which is affected in Parkinson. There's cerebellum, which is this part here, the small brain, that also is important in cognition nowadays, they think, but also in motor stuff. All these areas are very mixed. So, and secondly, the second question, we know, for example, if your parietal cortex is affected, which is behind the motor system, in between the visual system and the motor system, this is an associative network area that associate perception and action. But for example, if you have a lesion in the parietal cortex, you can neglect part of the world, which is the phenomena, well-known phenomena in neglect. If you have lesion in the frontal cortex, you lose this initiation of action or will to act. Supplementary motor area is very important for sequences. So we have way to go to understand all these things.
And if I could, thank you. If I could sneak in my sort of second question, which is more about the modeling. So I can see completely how something like a minimum jerk model provides an incredibly like rich description of how actions actually unfold. But do you think that the brain is actually like minimizing jerk, or do you think that that property, like kinematic property of the movement, is a consequence of it doing something else? If I imagine something like if I am performing actions through some kind of like forward modeling type process, it might be that if I'm really good at predicting action outcomes, I end up with a minimum jerk profile, but I'm not. The brain isn't trying to make jerk small.
No. I think it's always a good question, because I think it might be an emergent phenomena of the neural network or the neural dynamics, the way neurons are firing and connected, etc., etc. But for example, we know that minimum jerk and what I talked about, the affine geometry, are very much the same. So if you have coding of affine geometry, you will also have the jerk minimized, unless you have some lesions, you see?
I see, right, yeah.
You see, so for example, people in Parkinson, they don't minimize jerk anymore, because they don't have a fast movements, but they also have many little steps in between. So it's all, you see, so jerk is more Gestalt kind of principle that captures other things going underneath.
So it's the signature of this affine representation.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. Lovely, thanks.
But by the way, they are using a lot of minimum jerk nowadays in drones. Honestly, there's a lot of work on using drones. Some professor very well known, Vijay Kumar, knew about this model, and now how they plan the trajectory of drones and using similar principles. Also for automotive transformation, autonomous driving. So they also use jerk. So apparently it has strong features.
Yes, it does work. It just might not be how we work. But
yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. And next we have Deshen.
Hi, Tamar. Thank you. So it's this is certainly not my area, and I don't know too much about affine geometry, but I was curious, in one of your slides, you mentioned that there's some early results which shows that people use a combination of affine geometry and Euclidean geometry, if I got that right. And I just wanted to ask, is there any work that looks at whether this changes through a person's life? So, for example, most of us are familiar with Euclidean geometry, which we learn. Does that kind of shift the balance? Is it maybe we start off with thinking or representing more using affine geometry, and then because we get conditioned or we learn Euclidean geometry, that this switches? Or is your opinion that this is kind of static across time or even culture?
I think it's actually, first of all, this is a lot of it is done with Daniel Benekem. I don't know if people know him, but in Lambertos, but also in students of mine, Yaron Meirovich and David Ungerich. But that's how Piaget comes in. Because Piaget talked about in the beginning that when you draw a person, you more topological, but little by little evolve into being more Cartesian, whatever. I think in the motor domain, might be opposite. So more you do like Cartesian thing, and little by little you evolve to be more affine. Because affine buys you more, it's more economical. It allows you to have a duration that is more invariant across different kind of shapes. So at the beginning you do Euclidean things, but little by little you use this affine length to have affine motion. That's for children when they grow up. So you are right, it evolves in age. And I'm sure also in other animals. Not only in humans, because there have been studies in other animals that looked at minimum jerk or power laws, and they also have the similar phenomena. But this is
thank you.
Yeah.
Great. We have a few minutes for any last questions.
I had one more. I mean, the characteristic of movement is that it's always combining agonists and antagonists, right? And so I was wondering if there was something in affine geometry that was more adapted to this sort of dual command that's continuous, and that obviously you're losing, when you have jerk and so it's less.
Yeah. So agonists and antagonists are more on the execution of movement. Okay. So once you have a plan, then you have to execute it, and then you have this activation of both agonists and antagonists, and you can control the stiffness of the movement. So actually it goes with the fact that when you are just learning a new movement, you are more stiff. Okay. But when you learn it better, you relax the stiffness, and maybe you are less jerky. So fun is more about the kinematic plan, but we have to think now about the execution. So this kind of geometries not necessarily helps us to understand a lot about the execution. I think there is another kind of geometry which is called Riemannian geometry.
Yeah.
When you have to talk about forces, you have to put masses, inertia, etc., and you have to actually build a new kind of a combination between affine and Riemannian. Okay, because I focused mostly on kinematics. not forces. And there is dynamics, the forces that you are needing to generate in order to realize a wanted movement. Okay, you see what I'm saying? But I think kinematics, the forming the velocity in space and time, is higher level. It's more influence. We don't know ourselves what kind of forces we generate in each individual muscle. We have better perception of kinematics than dynamics.
I understand, but
I think so. I think so. I hypothesize. I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah.
No, so, and clearly, when you see what movement is, and especially ballistic movement, and clearly there's a system of tensors that has to solve a problem, but because you always have agonists and antagonists, it's always a dual problem.
Yeah.
You see
So,
what I mean? Perhaps.
So the way we think about it in the area, not only me, of course. You have kind of a desired trajectory, the way we have a desired trajectory that follow a fine velocity, but also maybe the geodesic is the shortest path or whatever. And then once you have this plan, you execute it by having some kind of a stiffness around this desired trajectory. And the stiffness is generated by having agonist, antagonist, or co-contraction. Co-contraction is when you contract both agonist and antagonist. Okay.
I see, but what I meant if you want to have the smoothest solution in this, you have to solve a tensor that will have to command in execution both agonist and antagonist, and obviously the laws that you are using to optimize this are laws to optimize the execution. So the reason why these laws are formatted are because they are trying to optimize execution under the constraint of optimal.
Okay, exactly. Yeah. So there is a lot of debate in the area actually, whether we want to minimize how much the forces change. The forces, not the kinematics, but the forces.
Yeah.
And it's a still open question, but you have to have a kind of a harmonious kind of integration of all these different problems together to generate a normal smooth motion. So we are, you understand? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I see your idea and all the experiments about the byte block or the stuff that you described about constraining the movements are probably going in the direction. I mean, the first one, not optimizing the forces, but rather the trajectory.
Right. And there's a lot of, and there is also adaptation. If you introduce a perturbation, external force you don't expect, the person returns to the kinematics, not to the, you see? So it's an evidence,
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed your question too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you so much.